Okay, good morning, everyone. Sorry for the slight delay. We had some technical difficulties, so we're going to slightly change the order of presenters and then go back to our normal order. So this is the climate action on land session, and that includes mitigation and adaptation actions. So we've got a wide variety of talks, and first up is Jeff from UBC, and I'll give it over to you. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to share a little bit of my early stages of my work on multifunctionality in temperate agriculture and some of our work on predicting co-benefits from cover cropping. So cover crops are plants that are typically grown between cash crops in the off-season, and they're grown for a lot of different reasons. Here, farmers planted hairy vetch. It's a legume. It can biologically fix nitrogen. Here, farmers planted barley, rolling it down to create a weed suppressive mulch. And then here, farmers planted cereal rye to overwinter in between some rows of corn to protect the soil from erosion and take up some residual nitrogen to hopefully prevent environmental issues like this eutrophication in the Gulf of Mexico, a lot of excess nitrogen and phosphorus coming in some waterways. So we know that cover cropping can provide a wide array of benefits, from greater soil organic carbon sequestration, maybe reduce nitrous oxide emissions, reduce nitrate leaching. But there's not a lot of work on actually how those different outcomes may synergize and the types of trade-offs that might also occur. We tend to just focus on single outcomes at a time. Nevertheless, we still focus a lot in terms of researchers and funders on cover crops. So in the US, in 2024 alone, over $250 million were allocated to support cover cropping in the country, far surpassing all these other agricultural practices. And in Canada, the On-Farm Climate Action Fund has identified cover cropping as one of its three key nature-based climate solutions that they're promoting. And so in 2022, 13 projects across the country received nearly $200 million. But there are minimal requirements to qualify for cover cropping cost sharing. And so when you look a little bit more closely at some of these policies, it's often stipulated that farmers need to produce just 15 centimeters of cover crop growth over the winter to qualify. That's not very much, and that's important because we know that cover crop biomass is related to ecosystem services or the delivery of these different outcomes that we're interested in. So if we're not actually producing enough biomass, the question remains, are we actually going to receive some of these outcomes? And so what you're looking at here are some thresholds or minimum amounts of biomass that different meta-analyses on cover crops have identified as being necessary to actually achieve or generate those outcomes. And so you have cover crop biomass on the y-axis and those 5 key outcomes along the x. So if we look at soil organic carbon, one meta-analysis found that you need at least 3 megagrams per hectare of biomass to actually appreciably increase soil organic carbon in an agricultural system. Another found that minimum amount to be 3.4. Thanks, Patrick. Another one found that maybe even 7 megagrams were necessary, and these are in temperate agroecosystems, I should also clarify. So another important finding was that there are a number of reviews that have also estimated, or I should say determined, the average amount of biomass that are produced in these different agroecosystems. And so in some of these temperate systems, around 3 megagrams is most common. And that means that all of those different outcomes, or those minimum thresholds above that yellow dashed line, are unlikely to be achieved. And another, I can advance the slide here, and another meta-analysis separated research station biomass production from on-farm biomass production. And when you look at just on-farm biomass, the average was under 1 megagram per hectare. So that is certainly below all those minimum thresholds. So taking this into consideration, sorry, I think we're both advancing and going back and forth here. We can reflect. This was kind of a motivating question for us, right? Thinking about these low requirements, and I got our team thinking about how can we design policy, inform policy design that more closely aligns with some of the current evidence on cover crops. So we have some main objectives for our research project. We want to assess the effect of cover cropping on multiple outcomes, so there's 5 key outcomes across different biophysical conditions, and importantly, different management approaches. Management is often left out of some of these large-scale evidence syntheses and meta-analyses, so we really wanted to focus on management. We want to scale up those findings to determine where the use of cover cropping is most likely to deliver co-benefits, and then compare some management and economic scenarios for hopefully some more context-specific policy development. So this is work that we're doing in concert with some NGOs, farmer-led NGOs that have a lot of influence on actual policy design in Canada. And then build a detailed, publicly available data set for some future applications. So we started off with a systematic review. We did a database search. We looked at 4 different databases. We collected around 500 different meta-analyses on cover crops. We did, of course, we deduplicated those, did some abstract screening, full text assessments, and we ended up with 73 different meta-analyses on cover crops and those 5 key outcomes. Those have been published since 2005, with over 60% of those published since 2020. And most of them have been on soil organic carbon and crop yield, with nearly 30 meta-analyses on just those 2 outcomes, and only around 7 that actually looked at multiple outcomes at one time. So our next step was to do a critical appraisal of these meta-analyses. Our hope here was to identify the highest quality data sets that we would then harmonize and use for our modeling. It sounded reasonably straightforward, but maybe easier said than done. I know a lot of folks in this room use secondary data sets, so here, I've de-identified 28 meta-analyses on the effect of cover cropping on crop yield. Well, out of those 28, only 11 had publicly available data sets. Out of those 11, just 4 had metadata so that we could actually understand and use those data sets. And then just 3 had information on cover crop biomass and some other key management factors that were really important to our modeling approach. So this extraction and harmonization stage has been a little bit more challenging than anticipated. We've had to go back to some primary studies. We're going to extract some additional data, particularly on management details. But we hope this effort is going to enrich the data that has already been collected, bring those together, make that available to the public, ideally address some of those limitations often related to the absence of management factors in some of these meta-analyses, and then make that more relevant to evidence synthesis. So try to more closely tie that to place-based policy with the ability to do some more granular analyses. The next step is some machine learning modeling. We want to use XGBoost, random forest, compare that to some linear regression. So of course we're still building data sets. This is just preliminary. But looking at, I'll skip that in the interest of time here, but looking at our crop yield data set, a lot of people use machine learning because of its ability to identify key predictors or features or predictors that are most important for the model. And so what you're looking at here is that cover crop type, for instance, is the most important on average in our models in terms of the cover crop's effect on crop yield, followed by nitrogen fertilizer rate, cover crop biomass, and a number of others. And you'll note that a bunch of management factors here are showing up as particularly important. And if we look at this figure, we get a little bit more insight. And each dot here represents an individual observation. And so if there's a positive SHAP value, that means crop yield increases. If it's negative, crop yield decreases. So if we look at that most important feature again, this is a binary variable. So the purple dots mean that cover crop type grass is a 0, so it's not a grass. You often see an increase in crop yield. When it is a grass, it's decreasing crop yield. This makes sense, of course. Grasses can compete with nitrogen and water with the main crop. Whereas when you're looking at a legume, it's adding some nitrogen to the system. So these are kind of just good checks on our initial approaches for this modeling that make good sense with the literature and what we know about cover crops in these systems. And the same with cover crop biomass. It's a little bit more complex. There's a lot of interactions going on here, of course. If you've got a lot of biomass and it's a legume, sure, we'll see some increases in crop yield, but it could be more complicated when it's different species, when it's not a legume. So, our last few steps here, We're going to combine some gridded feature data sets. Those different map layers are going to be drawn from the key predictors from those machine learning models. And then we can move on to that spatially explicit prediction. Again, as I mentioned, we're working with some farmer-led organizations here. The idea is hopefully a decision to support tool where we can compare different scenarios here. They were interested in return on investment, for instance, and some different management scenarios. So we hope that this has some real practical applied applications. And just finally, returning back to that question, we can offer maybe some preliminary or initial insights in terms of our thinking on this question. So we need to use some simple, cost-efficient proxies. It's really expensive. It's hard to monitor and verify some of these effects using things like planting date, termination date. It's maybe a good proxy for cover crop biomass production. Remote sensing is going to be increasingly important moving forward. I think avoiding sensationalized claims, positive or negative, about things like cover crops is going to help us not misdirect policy design or oversimplify their effects. These are complex ecological tools. And lastly, again, just really promoting context-specific co-benefits. Cover crops can provide a wide range of benefits potentially, especially if we think about them together, not in isolation. And so really trying to emphasize that multifunctionality also resonates more with farmers. I think that could be really useful for linking that in terms of our design of policy. And so with that, I'd like to thank two labs that I work with, authors who did share their data, which were very few authors, and funders as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We have time for one question.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Harrison Kipkule. I want to thank you for a very nice presentation. I have two questions. One is, are you considering a specific cover crop and its effect on a specific crop, or you are looking at cover crops in general? And also another one, the work which is still under progress on spatial prediction. What factors do you think play a significant role on the effect of cover cropping? Yeah, to see these spatial effects across different scales.
Okay, thank you for the questions. On the first point, we are looking at different types of cover crops, and not just a specific cover crop and not specific systems. This is limited to the data that we have access to. You can group cover crops by functional type, so legumes or non-legumes. You can talk about mixtures. You can get more specific than that. Obviously, there's trade-offs here if you get too specific in terms of our ability to have greater effect sizes in our modeling. So we will look at multiple, at least functional groups in particular. And cropping systems, there's a lot more research in grains than fruits and vegetables, but we do have some data on fruits and vegetables. We would probably exclude perennial systems, though. There's just a lot less work on cover crops and perennials, at least in the temperate regions that we're working with. And they operate a little bit differently in a perennial system. And then, sorry, can you remind, was the second question, what factors are going to be most important spatially? So I think spatially, when you constrain this to temperate regions, for instance, as opposed to global, if you go global, you tend to find pedoclimatic variables being most important. So you're going to start seeing things like temperature, precipitation, and various soil factors as being major drivers. When you constrain that and it starts to make those factors a little bit more similar, so just temperate regions, then all of a sudden we start to see a bunch of management effects be really important. And that is our effort to try to link this a little bit more closely to on-farm management, and also links to policy, whether we're talking about national, provincial, or at the state level, in, for instance, say just Canada and the US. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Great talk. So our next speaker is Matthew Hayek from NYU, and he'll be talking about livestock and forests.
Thanks so much, Kim. And thank you for organizing a really great cross-cutting section. I'm honored to be able to present in it, and it's about global trade-offs between beef production on pastures and restored ecosystem carbon. I'll get to what that means in a minute. This is a global empirical modeling study at a quite coarse resolution, so please keep in mind as I'm presenting all the inherent limitations that come with that approach, some of which I'll get more specific about partway through the presentation. But on a global scale, what we're talking about in terms of those trade-offs are trade-offs around how we use habitable and farmable land on Earth. About half of Earth's habitable land is agriculture, and 3/4 of that is just for the production of meat and dairy. 3/4 of that, in turn, about 30 million kilometers squared, is pastures for ruminant grazing, with the remaining quarter devoted to crop feeds for typically monogastric animals like pigs and chickens. However, of course, not all that grazing land is created equal, and one major gradient across that pasture land is moisture. In some areas, you have incredibly arid and xeric systems. Sometimes you have seasonal grasslands, and other times you have very humid, temperate, and tropical lush pastures. Importantly, if that pasture area were to shrink or changes were made to policy, you would see two different or many different replacement types of ecosystems and carbon responses in that ecosystem. So in a more xeric ecosystem, the vegetation might change at all, and there might even be negative changes to the carbon that system is holding in some cases. But generally speaking, in humid, year-round moist ecosystems like temperate forests and tropical rainforests, that would very quickly be replaced. Quickly, I mean, at an order of decades by trees and native biodiverse trees. So, in past work, we've managed to quantify this on a per hectare basis, or rather a per 5 arc-minute grid cell basis around a 10 by 10 kilometer resolution of the tropics, where essentially we took the product of current area that is in pasture times the ecosystem carbon regrowth that would be there if pasture weren't there. And that amounted to essentially a carbon opportunity cost of shrinking back or scaling back meat and dairy production, as well as some fibers, of around hundreds of gigatons of CO2 through the year 2100. However, of course, there's a huge limitation of this kind of conceptual modeling exercise in terms of scenario analysis. For any future projections of changes in the production and consumption of food through the year 2050 or 2100, and that limitation is mainly that the carbon cost of land, 1 hectare, 1 parcel of land, does not necessarily readily translate into the carbon cost of production, because what we're missing is the productivity of that pasture, which also varies pretty widely from xeric to moist landscapes, humid landscapes. In particular, pasture productivity can vary by more than an order of magnitude from one location to another. So just because you're losing 1 hectare of production, that doesn't necessarily readily translate into an amount of beef, pasture or beef or milk production from that loss. So what we really need is a carbon opportunity intensity of productivity. And you can slice this 2 ways. You can either look at the carbon opportunity intensity of pasture productivity with pasture production per acre in the denominator, or a carbon opportunity intensity of pasture-based beef productivity, which we looked at in this analysis, with beef production in the denominator. Another important limitation of this study is that this is taking a land-sparing and trade-off approach, and we are not going to be looking at co-location of mitigation activities or production versus sequestration activities such as silvopasture, but hopefully this can be a tool to make that comparison in the future. So starting off with number 1, which is this intensity of pasture productivity, you can now see pasture productivity in the top map, and this advancement was made using MODIS satellite imagery and estimates of NPP parameterized by the accessibility of that pasture resource to cattle, like which fraction of it was growing above ground and how much of it was out in the way in treacherous and easily eroding slopes that ruminants couldn't necessarily get to. And on the bottom, we are able to use these other products to translate that pasture productivity into beef productivity by understanding the proportion of pastures that is devoted to producing beef and the feed conversion ratio of beef and the dairy from beef, the beef from dairy herds normalized to one another on the right. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get sub-national feed conversion ratios, so this is another limitation of the approach. What we were able to see about this first intensity, that is the intensity of the pasture productivity, is some interesting patterns. So again, this is potential carbon regrowth in the denominator with pasture productivity in the denominator, so it's a pasture for ecosystem carbon trade-off. And you can see one glaring pattern where we have potential forest regrowth in green and potential grassland, shrubland, non-forest regrowth in the pink. And one major pattern that you can see is that generally forests have natively forested or potential forested areas have a higher carbon opportunity than potential pasture areas. This is pretty intuitive when we know that from previous research. What we didn't expect in this analysis is even among potential forest areas, there are pretty stark differences in terms of that intensity or that trade-off and the kind of distribution of those intensities. So I'm going to point to, if I can, I'm not seeing an ability to point, but you can notice in tropical South America and Central Africa is actually where we see some of those lowest trade-offs, versus in the temperate latitudes like Eastern North America, Russia, Northern and Western Europe, and Eastern China is where some of those trade-offs are actually pretty stark. That is, we're getting very little beef in comparison currently, or very little pasture currently in comparison to the amount of ecosystem carbon that could regrow were we not grazing cattle there. And you can see these same tendencies with, unfortunately, abbreviations for the region in the bottom that I'm going to point out a bit more of in the next chart. And again, some pretty stark differences that we expected between grassland and forest, including in Middle East and North Africa. We would actually expect to see a loss of carbon if ruminant animals were taken off that landscape. So importantly, we also looked at the carbon opportunity intensity of the beef productivity, that is pasture productivity times the feed conversion ratio. And we saw some pretty similar trends across two scenarios. One is current feed conversion ratios versus one of improved efficiency, where all regions lowered their pasture-based feed conversion ratios to 90% of the OECD levels of efficiency. So assuming that basically all regions are producing at high income country levels based on their current pasture base. And again, you can see Latin America, mainly South America and Sub-Saharan Africa emerging as places with the lowest intensity. And this surprised us because these are pastures that had replaced tropical forests. For the remaining areas that have a lower intensity, we plotted those areas on the next map. And there are two lower carbon intensity or high trade-off pasture areas in current areas that would otherwise be a forest biome that we plotted on this map. The first of which are the blue areas. These are areas that currently are experiencing a high trade-off or relatively low beef productivity in comparison to the amount of forest carbon that would return, but the trade-off would improve if feed conversion ratios would improve. In red are areas that have this high intensity, that is relatively lower beef productivity in comparison to the amount of forest that could regrow, and don't have much room for improvement because they are already operating at pretty high feed conversion ratios. So lastly, we created one global kind of thought experiment where we took the red areas out of production and further intensified all of the blue areas and the rest of global beef on global pastures until it came up to that amount of beef that was lost in the red areas. And these were our results. On the left, you can see that removal scenario. And what we found was that high opportunity cost or opportunity intensity potentially forested areas represent 13% of global pasture-based beef production, which could lead in turn to a much larger fraction of CO2 removal, that is around 125 gigatons of CO2, or more than the past 3 years of fossil fuel emissions. Not saying this is a replacement for fossil fuel mitigation, but just to put it in context. Meanwhile, intensifying all other regions up to the extent of 47% of OECD levels. So this is permitting a fair amount of kind of extensive pastoral agriculture in this scenario as well, would fully replace that beef production that was lost, but the replacement would predominantly occur again in Sub-Saharan Africa and South America. And that's it. There's a number of findings that are ways that we expect to be able to hopefully utilize this work in further scenario analysis. Even in light of the limitations, we believe that this provides some reasonable trade-off analysis that could be used for a number of things between dietary change and multilateral agreements between countries trading in beef that have forest restoration goals. And with that, thank you. This is a starting point on end of the conversation. I appreciate your attention.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. So you're under time, so you get a couple questions. Okay, I'm just going to take the first hand. So be fast.
Well.
Matt, thanks so much. As you know, I'm a big fan of your work, and thank you for giving the talk. The question is, this is fascinating, but when you talk about these trade-offs that are, continent to continent, country to country, is this just destined to be in the realm of the theoretical, or are there ways we can actually use this to make change?
So I think there are two ways that we can use this to make change, because I think a pretty non-ideal scenario would be that, there's no dictator moving land around and optimizing, beef production. And we wouldn't want that. But there are areas that have a high intensity versus a potentially lower intensity that are currently trading beef. For example, like France and Brazil, who are already in multilateral agreements on both things like beef trade and forest, decreasing deforestation and trying to meet forest restoration goals. So I think it could potentially be used as a starting point for bilateral agreements. That, and because it is at a sub-national resolution, this does have useful results within countries as well. Especially, you look at Brazil, and there was a lot of both blue and red areas. So we also want to be able to bring this to countries and, hopefully create an interactive tool where you can look at the within-country distribution of these pasture lands. Lastly, World Resources Institute is developing a similar pasture product at only a 30-meter scale, so we should be able to know this at a much higher resolution. This should be able to help with that cross-validation. Thanks, Tamar.
Thank you. One more question. Go around.
You very interesting work. I had a question about when you're assessing this, what is the role of what the land was in before, the legacy of that land use? I was looking at Australia, for example. This is where a lot of native vegetation was converted to pasture, and that led to huge water quality and water problems. So what role does it play where it was native pasture to begin with versus in regions where land use change has changed the dynamics of the system and there are other trade-offs?
Yeah, I think the idea of a historical land cover is controversial in itself, right? There's even a huge debate, even in the eastern United States, how much of that might have been open or closed when settler colonists came over, right? This is one version of that product where we look at what the land cover would be if humans completely abandoned that landscape. And I think there's still a lot of room to ask or account for whether indigenous and near Holocene levels of land management, how much those were actually human and ruminant managed landscapes. That is, not assuming that all humans just completely were eradicated off that landscape. I think that is a potentially spurious assumption that's being made here, but we don't really have good globally gridded products of that type of land management. But that's really the assumption, is that the returning land cover is absent any anthropogenic involvement.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That's great. Okay, so next up, we have Nettie Wallace from, if I'm going to get this right, from the University of Waterloo. And so this is for right. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about my research, which explores the use of biodigesters as a pathway to more sustainable manure management. And the reason we're exploring this is because in the way we currently manage manure, it has a large environmental impact. It creates harmful greenhouse gases, and it's very expensive to move. So we end up with these accumulation of manure across our landscape, which leads to really severe water quality issues. For instance, this is a picture of Lake Erie, which is about an hour and a half from where I go to university. And from this satellite imagery, you can actually see the size of the algae blooms that these lakes struggle with every year. So we're exploring biodigesters as a more sustainable pathway to manure management. To do this, we developed a process-based model across 263 regions of southern Ontario, and we're specifically exploring the corn and soybean cropland within these regions. It's a regional model, but still within that, there is variability in the nitrogen that's being applied to the landscape. So to kind of get our baseline scenario, we needed to assess how much fertilizer was being applied to the landscape and how much manure was being applied to the landscape. We used fertilizer sales data, and livestock population data to estimate this. And from our baseline scenario, we were able to come up with a number of how much nitrogen is lost through leaching across the study region. And then we asked ourselves, well, what happens if we added a biodigester to this landscape? How would this change the landscape? And it would change the landscape in a couple ways. Digesters produce digestate as their effluent, which is a nutrient-rich substance. And because the carbon is lost from the biodigester in the biogas that's generated, it's actually more nutrient-dense than manure, so it can be economically transported over a further distance than manure. This lets us spread the manure out on the landscape more evenly and wider. However, there's a number of field-scale studies that argue that when you replace digestate with manure, you actually end up with increased nitrogen losses, which is really bad for water quality. So we investigated this kind of trade-offs. Zooming into a region where we placed a theoretical biodigester, we found that exactly what the field-scale studies found. When you do a one-to-one replacement of manure with digestate, you actually do end up with increased nitrogen losses. But this is not how biodigesters actually operate on our landscape. They're not a one-to-one replacement. When you redistribute the digestate out from the biodigester, you're distributing it more evenly and wider. When you account for this and you explore it at a regional scale rather than a field scale, we find reduced nitrogen leaching losses, which lets us see that biodigesters might be able to be used as a tool to not only improve our manure management, reduce our greenhouse gases, but also let us implement targeted location to reduce our water quality impacts as well. So it kind of provides double benefits in that way. Thanks for listening. I'm happy to take any questions.
As you can see, that was a speed talk, so we can take a question or two. Thank you. You were perfect on time. It looks like, Tamar, did you have your hand up? Anybody? No? Was it you? No? Okay. I thought I saw a hand. Okay.
Well done on the speed. So I was involved in some work on biodigesters in Denmark, and similar to Matt, I also work on the carbon opportunity cost concept. And in Denmark, I don't know what the case is in Canada, but in Denmark, you have to add this kind of like crop sort of feedstock, and when you account for the carbon opportunity cost of that feedstock, you no longer get a net benefit in terms of emissions. And so I was wondering, I mean, you obviously had very little time. I don't know if this is something you considered in terms of like the emissions reduction implications.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So my work is actually part of a larger project which explores the biodigesters, and if you scan the QR code, some of that research is able to be linked there. But what we found is similar, that you have to utilize centralized digesters, so the scale matters, and also the type of waste you put in. I was exploring manure specifically, but for economic and different offsetting reasons, incorporating food waste is actually really beneficial to these systems, and it can actually tip the scale towards the more profitable or more offsets of carbon in the systems. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Nettie. So next we have Patrick, who will be presenting on behalf of Cecile Reiner. Correct.
Oh yeah. Okay, so thank you everyone. So as Kim said, I'm presenting on behalf of Cecile, who's a PhD student in my team. So you have to imagine that she's there instead of me. She's a much better company. But okay, so it's a work, and it's a work really in progress, really very much in progress. So every thoughts, comments are very useful. Okay, so the background is something that we know. We have multiple sustainability issues, including climate, biodiversity, and land use is a nexus for many of these things. And so we also seek solutions through land use. Okay, but oftentimes we work and we try to seek and explore these solutions a little bit in silos. There's many of them, and we produce these kind of maps. So this is a map of global safety nets, so places that we should try to conserve in a 30% or 50% scenario. Maps of places where we could plant trees to stop more carbon maps. This is an exercise where we try to replicate a World Bank analysis, looking for places where we could expand cropland for food production with relatively low environmental impacts, and works and maps looking at places to grow bioenergy on abandoned land. And all these maps are done, and oftentimes if you look at these maps, you see that they will tend to highlight sometimes the same areas for different reasons. And at the same time, we know that the planet is already very much used, so we have already 3/4 of the planet basically that we use or manage for some purposes. There's basically a quarter there which is unconverted and not really managed, but this is with the nature that we've left, so it's not as if it was useless. So basically the idea in the exercise, it's a kind of simple exercise in a sense, although Cecile worked a lot for that, but to try to quantify and specialize some of these major solutions to address climate and biodiversity. And we try to do that essentially based as much as possible on actual commitments, and pledges and policies from different actors, mainly from countries, not trying to avoid scenarios that we are doing, researchers. And we do that naively, so one thing at a time, just to say, okay, at the end, how do they overlap, how do they behave a bit spatially, and it's a bit an exercise to rethink a little bit the role of land use in solving these issues. There's other ways to do it. Modelers do that. They take all these solutions, they put them together in the model, and they come up with a map. We didn't do that. First, we don't have the models to do that, but also it was a way to do a different kind of exercise. So when, of course, modelers do that, they have to make a number of assumptions in their model, etc. And the fact that they come up with scenarios where you have reconciled these things, somehow it hides a little bit what happens if you have all these actors individually who do their things in silos. So this is what we wanted to reveal a little bit. Also, what do we look at? So we look at renewable, so that's the top. Renewable energy infrastructure, so solar panels, wind farms, mining for energy transition minerals, so for these solar and wind farms, but also batteries, etc., etc. Land-based bioenergy, there we were very conservative, because we use, we take the pledges of decarbonization, so we only use a very residual amount of bioenergy. This day we use a scenario because there's very few countries who make actual pledges on bioenergy. Tree planting for restoration, which is coming from the land gap report, and conservation coming from the CBD commitments, and there we use the by country, so we assume that each country does the 30% objective. So for all, and on top of that, we have current croplands, so we don't project cropland further, because that's not a policy. We don't have so many countries that have a policy on expanding cropland, but we take the current cropland at least to overlay. So for each of these things, basically we take, so as I said, the required or the pledge areas, we take suitability maps that exist, or we fine tune some of them to select the pixels that are the places that are best suited. So we say, this is a policymaker that wants to do restoration planning, they plan restoration on the best land for restoration, etc., etc. We add the 2020 distribution, so we can project the 20 to 2050 expansion. We have the 2020 distribution. We have the 2050 distribution. So this is like each individual maps, and then we overlay. Then we put them together, and so you see the different colors. I will not talk so much about the maps themselves because it's very fresh, and I haven't had really the time to dig into the special patterns, and maybe we have to fix a few things, but we see that there are clusters of regions of the world where we would expect bioenergy from lignocellulosic approaches, for example, in the pink there, or larger areas of restoration for carbon. And then we look at the overlaps and we count the overlaps, and we see that probably the major overlaps that we see is the medium orange which is overlap between current croplands and what we call nature here, but which includes both conservation and restoration for carbon. Okay, what does it mean in total for 2050? This is a bit the range of the areas needed. You see, of course, the big thing is conservation. It's not exactly 30% because of calculation and distribution things, but it's aimed to be 30%, and then carbon restoration, and then the other land users take a slightly smaller footprint. Well, I'll come back to that in the conclusion. And so we have current cropland, but we, as I said, we don't project it. Overlaps overall, if you look at that, the overall proportion of overlaps is relatively small, about 10% of all these solutions, but this is essentially because conservation is so much expanding everywhere that, of course, none of the other can overlap with conservation as conservation. If we look at the 2x2 overlaps in absolute terms, and the big thing that we see is between current cropland and conservation or restoration. So conservation, actually, in fact, we took priority suitability areas for conservation, and they do include cropland if you want to reach 30%. So in fact, it's conservation and rewilding. You want to see it like that. And conservation between new generation bioenergy and cropland conservation and carbon restoration. Okay, if you look in terms of percentage of each of these solutions, what we see, as I said, the overall overlaps are small, but that's mainly driven by conservation. But for the other ones, we see quite notable overlaps with the different things together. So even if we take a very conservative bioenergy scenario, it still overlaps with a lot of the other things. Renewable energy overlaps with a number of other things, about 50%, 50-60% of renewable energy infrastructure. Some of these overlaps can be synergies. Maybe if we have wind farms on cropland, it may function. Some of these may not function so well, so conservation and restoration. And about 1/3 of current cropland is basically overlaying with one of these solutions. This is what it corresponds in terms of global land use. So on the left, it's the current planet, more or less. And on the right is the additional things that we would like to have on the planet if we implement this solution. So basically, these are the scenarios that we did things with, that we specialized. There's an additional bioenergy done on forest that we didn't specialize because it's too hard to really see where's the potential. As these things overlap on cropland, if we just want to maintain the same amount of cropland, this is the amount of additional cropland that we have to find somewhere, and then there's conservation that is not on cropland, but it could be on pasture, because we don't have pasture here, okay, so that's the conclusion. So if we really want to implement all these solutions together, it's potentially a very large lot of land use change. These solutions, they are often thought and planned and optimized in silos, so we see that there's large overlaps, so it means that we do have to make more work at comprehensive and deliberative and democratic deliberation about who wants what on these different lands. And just to make it clear that if you look at the numbers, the order of magnitude of bioenergy and renewable electricity were roughly similar, about 1.52 million square kilometers. But as I said, basically it's 100% renewable energy for the whole planet versus a very small share of CO2 removal for bioenergy. So it's not at all the same kind of benefits for society.
All right, thank you so much, Patrick. I want to ask you like 10 questions, but I'll talk to you later. So I'm going to ask the audience if you have any questions for Patrick. Everybody needs coffee this morning. Then I will ask you. So did you, in terms of the model, you said you modeled everything separately and then looked at overlaps. Were you just looking at the highest potential locations? So you were just putting everything in the most beneficial areas to do bioenergy or wind or what have you?
Yes, but depending on the scale. So, for example, for the carbon restoration pledge, this is pledge made by country. So we did make the assumption that if they pledge for their own country, they would do it in their own country. And so we distribute it optimally within the country. And we have different things, but I don't show it. But basically, we take the bins of optimization and say what happens if we start by the 1% per pixel or we spread it by the 5% per pixel.
Other questions? No? Okay, I'm going to ask one more then. In terms of, have you thought about next steps, like thinking about land tenure or maybe path dependencies in terms of which things are chosen first, or even looking at whether what's currently in place is representative of the most beneficial locations to do some of these things?
No, so we do include the current location of all these things as far as we have them, but we know next steps. No, I don't think that we necessarily will go in this analysis at least further in terms of land tenure and or forest dependent people or these kind of things. I think we'll try to stay. I mean, Cecile, what she wants to do is to basically mainly her objective is to take these maps and use that as an engagement tool with policymakers and to just help them reflect on, okay, this is the policy that you have in all your different ministries.
Okay, thank you so much, Patrick. I believe that I have to look at my list of speakers here. Just a second. Next. Okay, let's give Patrick a round of applause while we move on to the next one. All right, so now we're going to zoom into India, which, as you noticed from Patrick's maps, is quite a jam-packed place, an overlapping place. And you can pull up the next one. So this is Annika Amadon from New York University. Oh. Yeah, let me get the right one up there. Anyway, but you can still come up, grab your microphone. It should be...
Hi, I'm Annika Amadon from New York University. This is a project that I worked on for my senior thesis in undergrad this past year. And I'm currently based at Cambridge doing other work in biology. So yeah, this is, it was studied over a short time period, so just bear with me. Okay, so I'm asking a seemingly straightforward question in this study. Does India have enough land to meet their ambitious climate mitigation targets? And then I asked this question to then quantify the land needed for their NDC mitigation goals. So for some background, national climate mitigation goals, which rely upon land action and effective management to be met, are becoming increasingly ambitious, particularly across the primary sectors of agriculture, forestry, and clean or renewable energy solutions. We know that land is not an unlimited resource, as we've kind of explored this across many different presentations in the past few days. And India lends itself particularly well to a study of a case where land is a potentially limiting mitigation factor. I feel like we touched on this in some of the plenary talks as well. They're the most populated country in the world, home to over 1 billion people, and they have the highest proportion of land use for agriculture at nearly 61% cropland. The nation will play a critical role in near-term anthropogenic climate change, with current emissions expected to increase to up to 4.3 gigatons CO2 emitted by 2030. India's NDC, under the Paris Agreement, makes definitive and ambitious climate commitments across the energy and forestry sectors, delineate goals of a set amount of greenhouse gas emissions mitigated per sector, specified amounts of land use set for a given sector's mitigation activities, or both. land areas designated by the government are deemed by many studies going through literature reviews to be insufficient to meet their joining greenhouse gas emission goals in the forestry sector, and bottom-up studies that convert India's energy goals into tangible land quantities for mitigation specifically are much higher than previously anticipated by the government. Furthermore, the study will also hold cropland to be constant they will assume it to be held constant, but it is likely to constrain achieving the forestry and energy mitigation targets, given the high proportion of cropland. So with this considered, realistic quantities of land needed and set aside in the proposed NDC may not only be overlapping and insufficient to meet greenhouse gas goals, but may actually exceed the land area of the whole nation, which is kind of meant to be, it's compared to the whole size of the country as a means of showing just kind of how egregious these claims can be when there's not a coordinated approach to making these climate pledges. So the study itself asked first, what are the discrepancies between land area commitments for mitigation as determined by the Indian government and the land area found more likely to be necessary from bottom-up scientific research across a systematic review. 2, when emission goals are translated into land area quantities, is there enough land area to meet even India's NDC emission mitigation goals? And if not, how will the understanding of former land use and future land use potentials across sectors allow India to minimize mitigation land use while maximizing mitigation potentials? And then where within the nation will a limited amount of land be a more pressing constraint? Okay, so to this, I'm sorry, it's a little bit hard to read the figure, but I'll talk through it. So to do this, I first have to review India's NDC commitments, finding that they commit to 50% of their power from non-fossil fuel sources by 2030 and an emissions intensity reduction of 45% in the energy sector. And then in the forestry sector, they commit to the creation of a carbon sink of over 2.5 billion tons of CO2 and additional forest cover using 26 million hectares of designated land. And then there's, again, a notable omission of any mitigation action in the agricultural sector, which in the last presentation, it was noted that a lot of countries actually omit this from their mitigation plans, but there is potential that this is a combination of industry interests and the dimensions of food insecurity and crop yield within the nation. So the study again holds existing cropland to be constant. Then I go through existing literature across a few different databases and find data sets that convert the land quantity used to realistically quantify the amount of land needed per mitigation sector that would meet the NDC's emission goals in comparison to the total land area of India to quantify discrepancies between both India's emission and land goals, and then between these goals and the actual amount of land needed for the desired action. Going from there, I go through the government-based data sets found on the Indian government's websites to list the total cropland areas, total forested areas, total state land area, total solar and wind potentials, and the amount of solar and wind potential already being used in order to directly identify and compare in a statewide table these mitigation potentials across the different sectors. In the table, it's not the focus of the study, but I include the WRI groundwater stress values by Indian state within the table in the last column as a means of just introducing potential mitigation constraints beyond land amount. So states that indicate high or extremely high stress values are marked as areas where mitigation decisions may have to be made if the land is found to be sufficient. So the initial steps of the land quantification assessment are taken on a sectoral basis. So this is just one example within the forestry sector of how I went about this. So it just was the goal of quantifying first how much land is necessary per sector of idealized sectoral mitigation action as per the NDC, and then situating these values in comparison to the total land area of India to comprise the initial result. So here is the total across the 3 sectors of all of the land amounts found to be necessary across 3 land use scenarios. There's a high land use scenario where it is assumed using the literature review that the least land efficient mitigation actions are relied upon to meet emission goals. A low land use scenario where the most land efficient mitigation actions are relied upon, typically those using land sharing measures, at least across 2 different sectors. And then a mean calculation using multiple data inputs across many of the bottom-up studies that are in my works cited, and if you want to ask more about which data sets I use, feel free. But that agree upon these land quantities needed within a range of consensus. So again, agricultural land is held constant, but you can see that these values are in each sector are then compared to the total amount of Indian land needed. So in the low land use scenario, the study finds that their mitigation goals call for around 241 million hectares of land to meet their mitigation goals plus the croplands. And the high land use scenario amount of land needed reaches 388 million hectares of land needed. The mean land use scenario using these studies reaches 341 million hectares. So in both the high and mean land use studies or scenarios, the amount of land necessary exceeds the total size of India as a nation. Again, with the goal of pointing to how egregious these claims can be when they're not cross-checked across sectors. So given that the study only looks at fitting mitigation practices within India's land area, not even considering other dimensions of land use or claims such as population size or spread, we determined that there's likely not enough land to meet India's NDC mitigation goals as they stand. In response to this land constraint here, I have created here, but it has all of the states in the format and a link in the presentation to the actual land amounts as reported, as well as the most agreed upon land quantity or agreed upon energy and forestry mitigation potentials as found across the literature, meant to respond to how the process of these mitigation commitments have been decided upon. Separate ministries and governments, intergovernmental groups have so far been relied upon to provide information on each sector's potentials and recommended actions clearly with differing interests and levels of information. So this table and this research is intended for use for a collaborative approach to be taken as a preliminary tool for harnessing the highest amounts of mitigation potential on the lowest quantity of land on a regional basis. And again, the groundwater stress column, it introduces the idea of additional constraining mitigation factors in a state-wise manner. So for more information on how to interpret the table or a demonstration of its utility, feel free to ask me in my free time. I'm running low on time. I still have many slides, so I think, yeah, this gets across my results, so it's okay. Okay, yes, I kind of touched upon all of the conclusions and the findings, basically the point of what actually was asked. And then the limitations, just briefly touching on, there are a lot of the same limitations regarding data set access, especially as an undergrad. I faced a lot of rejection from universities that had control of all the data sets. So I was not able to map this in the way that I wanted. Again, I also don't have the geospatial skills, but based on the presentation right before this, I've seen that people are doing these skills, or doing this type of mapping that I hope to be doing already, so it's really lovely to be in a conference setting like this, where I can see people doing the work that I kind of hope to do, but it's getting out there, so yeah, thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Annika.
Sorry, it's probably
great. Any questions? Anybody? Indian NDCs. Wow, we need to like pass coffee around the room or something at this point. Well, I'm just gonna, since we're already running behind, I'm gonna say thank you, but also point out that Annika just graduated and did this as her undergrad senior thesis. So I think she she might be one of the youngest participants at the conference. Okay, thank you. All right, so we'll move on to the next presentation. So we got two. So John, you are up next. This is a speed or flash talk again, so it's 3 minutes.
Yes, I will try my best to keep it 3 minutes, but it's going to be tough. So I can start while it's getting loaded. So I'm going to talk about peatlands and ways of understanding the impact of methane emissions associated with peatlands. So peatlands are waterlogged habitats. Because they are waterlogged, the soil carbon has, here we go, I'll zoom ahead for the picture to illustrate it. Okay. So the waterlogged soil means that got there in the end, aerobic respiration is slowed, so you have an accumulation of carbon, but you do have a trade-off where there's anaerobic respiration. So some carbon is respired as methane instead of carbon dioxide. Here's an illustrative peatland in Ireland. Today the talk is mostly about northern temperate peatlands. I think it's a UK case study. Most of the conclusions should extend beyond that, but caveat there. So as we're looking into the potential climate value of restoring peatlands, our general understanding is that the balance between carbon dioxide sequestration or emission and methane emission is a function of the water table, where the lower the water table, the soil is dried out, you're just losing carbon dioxide. As you raise the water, re-wet it, you eventually shift from carbon emissions to carbon sequestration, but as you get extremely waterlogged with a very high water table, you get increasing methane emissions. And in the conventional way of aggregating these in the CO2 equivalent, there's a kind of optimum water table depth of around 10 centimeters where you're net sequestering. If you're wetter than that, your methane overwhelms the benefits of the carbon dioxide removals, and if you're drier than that, you're just constantly leaking CO2 to the atmosphere. However, there's quite a body of literature suggesting that it's very hard to understand this balance of methane versus carbon dioxide, because you can't really equate them that straightforwardly. So there's a study about 10 years ago arguing that this method, global warming potential of aggregating gases, is challenging to apply and understand for ecosystems, because you have sustained rather than individual pulse emissions and a balance of potentially natural and anthropogenic emissions. Some have argued that actually methane is even worse than this conventional evaluation, and it might actually not be very sensible on balance to restore peatlands because of this methane impact. But other studies have argued, no, if you do the climate modelling, you're going to go super fast. If you do the climate modelling, actually this doesn't really reflect methane in practice. And if you spin out the temperature change over time, not looking at equivalent emissions, then it's always good to restore peatlands as early as you can. Why is this? Because when we compare different gases as an equivalent, we're actually trying to squeeze things into an approximation that doesn't really make sense. So if we have an equivalent mass of carbon dioxide and methane, and the conventional metric, they have the same impact average over 100 years, but for methane, that's actually a very strong initial spike that is automatically removed, whereas for carbon dioxide, it's kind of permanent. I'm not going to talk about nitrous oxide in the interest of time. Recognizing this, the IPCC, at least from the physical science, doesn't really recommend any individual metric. It suggests you might want to look at different metrics, and your metric choice should be dependent for your question of interest. So the most recent report has a range of figures. The standard version, the GW100, would say methane is worth 27 tons per ton of methane. Could be much higher if you have a shorter perspective, much lower with the GTP. There's also novel approaches that say you just can't imagine one gas acts like an individual emission of another gas. So GWP star, for example, here conceptualizes methane as a very big carbon dioxide emission, but then a kind of automatic carbon dioxide removal, which can capture this dynamic behavior. So I can finally talk about actual research in my time is up. So in collaboration with the Wildlife Trust through our conservation body in the UK, we looked at their peatland restoration data. So they have peatland areas that are degraded and drained, so constantly emitting CO2. They restore them initially by re-wetting them, that's where we are now, and then they want to restore them further to return the biodiversity to a near natural state. To try and understand, is this actually good for the climate, we looked across all these metrics, and the good news is that it doesn't matter which metric you use, even the GWP20, which has a very high methane valuation, it's still a reduction in net emissions. And if you look at the longer term metric, the GTP100, then you value methane less, so you're a net removal in the long term perspective. It's still hard to anticipate what's actually happening from these pulse metrics, so we also looked at cumulative GWP star over time. Not really going to be able to explain this in the time I have, but it's essentially showing if we just let them stay degraded, we'll have continuously increasing extra warming because we just have year-on-year CO2 release. Whereas if we restore them, we do get an increase in methane-induced warming in the green, but the CO2 removals are enough to more than compensate that. And if we carry on keeping them in a restored state, then we just keep on removing CO2, but we have a fixed amount of methane-induced warming. To try and justify this is all very arbitrary at the moment. We can actually line up these GWP star modeled emissions with an actual climate model, and hopefully you can believe me that the dynamics are captured quite well for just letting them remain degraded and for restoring them. We'll entirely skip over the sensitivity analysis. Say thanks for the time. So I think the conclusions, standard CO2 equivalence has issues in trying to understand how peatlands contribute to climate change and climate change mitigation. From this study, we've thankfully demonstrated that it's universally good to restore peatlands anyway, and that we have novel metrics and applying a range of different metrics can better illustrate these temporal trade-offs. Thanks for the speedy talk. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any questions, but perhaps they can find you after the talk. So next up, we have Andrew Zimmer from the Montana State University, presenting on behalf of Cascade Tucholsky. Yes.
I knew I was going to trip. Yeah, thank you. Sadly, Cascade can't be here to present, so I was more than happy to take a trip to Oaxaca to present some of his research. And I'm also glad to be in this session where we're talking about reversing land degradation. And I'm here maybe to give some insight onto the human consequences of restoring some of this land. So this is a project funded by the NASA Land Cover and Land Use Change Program. Nina Brooks is the main PI. Cascade is leading this paper, and it is very much in progress, so any thoughts or feedback are really appreciated. This is in collaboration with Dr. Kwa Andem at IFPRI in Abuja, Nigeria. So we have people on the ground that we're consulting with and working with to be able to provide actionable insights. And so broadly, we're focused on tracking dangerous heat exposure across Africa's Great Green Wall. And we'll get into what the project is a little bit later. So to provide some context, the Sahel, the African Sahel is one of the most vulnerable regions to the impact of climate change, whether that's from extreme heat or floods, droughts. Primarily on the climate side, things are changing. On the population side, the region's population is rapidly increasing from 21 million in 1960 to over 100 million in 2020, and that is projected to increase into the future, so potentially by 300 to 400 million by 2045. So not only do we have a lot of people exposed to climate hazards, but we also have a very young population. So on the top right of your screen here is a figure that shows dependency ratio in cities across Nigeria. For those of you that know demography will know what I mean by dependency ratio. But it basically compares young people and old people to working age people. So it gives you a figure that tells you what the population pyramid looks like, how many vulnerable people you might have within a population. Typically, younger people and older people are more vulnerable to climate hazards, whether that's extreme heat or air pollution. And we can see in the northern area of Nigeria, we have really high dependency ratio rates. And so that's a lot of young people in that region, and that's predicted to increase into the future. So we have a young population, we have a lot of people. We also have high rates of food insecurity, poverty, and political instability and violence. So all of these things kind of compound and create this really vulnerable scenario. And so the Great Green Wall Initiative is heralded to alleviate lots of these problems. It will reduce land degradation, it will alleviate poverty, it will allow for productive agriculture in this region. I saw it come up on some of the maps that were shown in previous talks. This area that has potential. It's raised a lot of money. It's championed by the United Nations. More than $14 billion has been raised and pledged. And since 2007, some of these initiatives have been started. However, it's not all rosy. There is evidence that the Great Green Wall project has limited poverty alleviation. The projects are kind of implemented in a scattershot method. In some places they have certain priorities, and in others they're not as effective. And what we're really interested in is this process of the greening of the Sahel and what the human impact of that from a heat perspective is. The Sahel has greened, as we'll get into a little bit later. Some of this may be due to shifting rainfall patterns, maybe not the project itself. And experiments, future climate projections suggest that this increased greening may lead to an increased incidence and occurrence of extreme humid heat waves. So this combination of high temperatures, but also high humidity, which can be really hazardous to human health. And so our main research question is, in the African Sahel, where is greening co-occurring with increases in dangerous humid heat? So to kind of explain what we mean by humid heat, we have this nifty little infographic here. So we know climate change is increasing temperatures. It's also changing moisture patterns globally. And so we have an increase in humidity in some pixels, we have an increase in temperature in some pixels. At the same time, any changes in land use can also do the same. They can alter moisture patterns, they can also alter temperatures. Urban heat island effect is a great example. If we change the land surface, that alters the temperature. Equally, if we plant lots of crops, they can change the moisture. And so we have this situation where we are in a warming environment and we add a lot of moisture and increase the incidence of these humid heat events. And typically, heat exposure and the impacts on humans from an epidemiological perspective is just a function of ambient temperature. So the amount of temperature and what's the kind of health impact of that. Physiologists take a different approach. They're often locking people in tanks, making them exercise while they alter the temperature and the humidity, and they can really understand at a human level what the impact of both temperature but also humidity is. And so there's kind of a difference there between the ways these things are measured, and we're trying to push towards the incorporation of humidity into some of these assessments to understand the impact of that on human health across the region. And when you add humidity to these temperatures that are increasing, it has this exponential effect. So you only need a small amount of humidity with a high temperature that makes these really dangerous humid heat waves. And so with future projections, we know we have a warming climate, we know we also have more moisture, and so combining those together, we have this increased incidence of really dangerous temperatures and humid heat waves. And so putting that together across the Sahel region, we use lots of different data sets and we align them geospatially. So we're using long-term global land change from the University of Maryland's GLAD program. It's approximately 5 kilometers at the equator. We couple that with a few different metrics to measure extreme heat. And so we use wet bulb globe temperature, which incorporates this humidity. We also use heat index. We'll use heat index for the remainder of the talk. We use certain thresholds. So for wet bulb, we use 30 degrees Celsius, which is an international labor standard for dangerous humid heat. And for heat index, we use 40.6 degrees, which is what the U.S. National Weather Service uses for heat advisories. So if you live in the southern U.S., you're probably familiar seeing where temperatures exceed them. It can be really hazardous for human health. And so that's what we use here. These are created using temperature data sets and downscaled moisture from ERA 5. So aligning them at that 5 kilometer resolution. The next phase of this work, which we won't touch on today, is adding in age and sex population data from WorldPop, which is a synthetic population product, which goes beyond just providing the number of people in pixels, but to describe the type of people that live within them. So are they young or old? Are they male or female? So we can get a bit more granularity on the exposure. So the map on the right kind of shows these data sets all together and laid on top of each other. So you can kind of see the band across the Sahel. This represents short vegetation increase, so a greening process, if you will. And we also have a trend of wet bulb globe temperature in red. And so we can see just visually, we have areas that are greening, and we have the same areas that are warm. And so what we're really trying to do is figure out that happening in the same location and what the mechanism is behind it. So some initial results here. In the top left-hand side, we have the change in humid heat days per year. So the red areas are warming, the blue areas are cooling. We have that cooling area in South Sudan. We haven't quite figured out what it is. Any insight is appreciated. But most of the Sahel is warm, as you can see. So pixels are red. And that's up to 3 days per year extra of these really extreme temperatures. The bottom panel on the left-hand side is greening, so areas that are green have been greening. Areas that are white are not. And then on the right-hand side, we have this correlation between the pixels, so the pixel level, which areas are warming and greening. Obviously, we have a lot that aren't warming or aren't greening. Those are the white spots in the figure on the left-hand side. But we also have a lot of areas that are warming and greening at the same time. So we have this relationship between greening and warming, which can be hazardous for health. And when we bin this by changes in short vegetation, we start to see this kind of pattern emerge more clearly. So at the top, we have an increase in short vegetation. So these are pixels that are greening. We have an increase in days per year for over the heat index thresholds. So these greening areas are warming. Browning pixels stay about the same. So it's warming, but we have this extra moisture in certain areas, and that's adding to this increased incidence of dangerous heat days. What we are also pushing to now is disaggregating this heat index into the kind of individual constituent variables. So we're able to look at air temperature, humidity, and vapor pressure, so we can have a greater understanding of what's really driving these patterns. So we have circled here a few examples. On the left-hand side, this kind of left column is browning pixels. The middle is pixels that haven't changed, and the right-hand side is greening pixels. So if we just look at the greening pixels, as we move through the decades, we can see this increased heat index for these greening pixels. We see the 2-meter air temperature hasn't really changed much, so it's being driven primarily by that humidity component. If we look at browning pixels, the minimum humidity is decreasing across the decades. So these pixels that are getting brown with less vegetation, there's less humidity in them as well. And so we have some evidence that these things are kind of happening in tandem. And so to wrap things up, as I mentioned, we're in the middle of this process. A few thoughts and next steps. We really want to understand what's driving these patterns. We know that they're happening at the same time, but we'd like to understand, is it rivers? Is it local land change? What's the role of surface water in kind of driving these patterns? And also pushing to overlay this with population experts to understand, okay, in some areas it's warming and greening, but are people there and what are the type of people there? To be able to put in adaptation and mitigation strategies. So I'll leave it there, but happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Questions?
Hi, Pam from the University of Michigan. Just a question about whether you considered adding housing material to any of your analysis at that population level, because what we observe in so many places is that this trend towards putting iron sheets on your house is meaning that indoor temperatures are just increasing, like actually more than the temperature increases that you're observing through greening pattern, or changes that you're observing through greening patterns.
We haven't, but it's a really great point. Yeah, I mean, having the data is part of the limitation of that, to be able to measure roof type, but also measure the temperature within buildings. But it's something that's a really important point.
Any census or population representative data set will have those basic variables on the material of the housing, because that's always used for calculating a wealth index. So I bet it's there if you've got it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Love to talk more about it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Good idea. Thank you. I think we have time for one more quick question. Nobody? Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Andrew. And very last, but definitely not least, we're going to move to the United States. We have a of the presentation.
Hi, everyone. I know it's close to lunch. I appreciate you being here and staying to the very last session. As my presentation is pulling up, I'll just do a little introduction. My name is Elisa Carter. I'm a Postmaster's Research Associate at the Public Lands Policy Group at Colorado State University. And today I'll be presenting our published paper in Regional Environmental Change. I'll put a link at the end if I have to breeze through this presentation, just in case you want more insight on climate mitigation and adaptation relationships within forest management in the fire-prone American West. So I'll just get right into it. There we go. Just for some conceptual and theoretical background, I want to kind of piece apart these dynamics between mitigation and adaptation. I think we all know what this is. They're kind of two sides of the same coin when it comes to climate action, and land management and land use has a really integral role to play. And so I have here, even if greenhouse gas emissions were reduced dramatically, mitigation on its own is not sufficient to protect lives and other values under projected warming. We're inching through 1.5 degrees Celsius, so we can't ignore both, and I think land has to work in tandem to approach these issues. Historically speaking, from International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the UNFCCC, mitigation and adaptation have been kind of approached pretty separately in the dialogue so far. Two measures are for practical reasons, just through different objectives, scope, time dimension, level of collaboration required. Obviously, carbon valuation is often talked at the global level, and now we're going to the localized level, but historically speaking, that's been the case. And then adaptation has been more of like a localized context and discussion. And even though that's changing, we have the global goal on adaptation coming up. There still needs to be more merging of how these concepts interact together. That being said, there is a growing body of literature on the relationship between adaptation and mitigation so far. So we see Climate Change and Land by IPCC, and then UNFCCC Adaptation Committee has produced a discussion on this work as well. In my paper, we've gone through a literature review process on how they're conceptually feeding into one another, and this is from Naguma et al. From 2014, talking about just an example of how development projects specific to land use management has described mitigation and adaptation either as separate measures, maybe one is prioritized over the other, and what we're really looking for is synergy. So why does this concept matter? I think it's really important, and hearing from other discussions throughout GLP, we have to have more of a localized context. We have to speak with natural resource managers who are on the ground dealing and managing these lands. And so our main research question was to figure out how forest experts in the American West view the relationship between mitigation and adaptation. This is our geographic scope. We kind of divided it into two regions: Pacific Northwest ecoregions, which is very vast and of course very diverse. They have, old growth forests that everyone thinks about. That's near the Pacific coast. And then you also have pine-dominated forests as well, and the Cascades that are really fire prone and fire adapted historically. And then in the Rocky Mountains, we have pine-dominated forests as well, which is super fire prone. We wanted to study this context because, forestry, obviously it's a natural carbon flux system, but so, there's that potential and obviously that link with mitigation there, but when it comes to adaptation, it's facing a lot of unprecedented scope in terms of wildfire severity, intensity, area, and that's something that we can't ignore. So we talked with forest experts, 38 of them for about an hour, maybe more, to understand what are they perceiving as mitigation and adaptation activities on the ground. And then what are the conflicts and synergies between how they perceive these actions interacting in land management, and then what are the factors that influences the successes or challenges in promoting synergy here. I'm going to mostly focus on 1 and 2, and 3 will come in when needed, but if you want to read more about it, I'll have the link at the end. So, what are the activities perceived as adaptation by forest managers? We have species composition and placement. This means seed source movement trials, adapting to a future climate scenario in their ecoregion for the future. So this involves seed banks, genetic modification. This is something that they're really thinking about. There's a lot of logistic issues with that, so they feel like maybe they're not really in the right time and place to prepare for, let's say, a new climate 50 years from now. So that's something to consider, and they're asking for more money when it comes to research infrastructure there. Of course, there's fuels management and restoration and reforestation as well. And that's something that we need to address through fuel breaks, through prescribed burns, cultural burns, and thinning of forests sometimes too. So there's concern over climatic shifts impacting species viability, diversity, and increasing fire risk. And restoration of forests, particularly in fire-prone contexts, really means bringing back fire and integrating indigenous knowledge and stewardship and rights holdership into the discussion of natural resource management to enhance resilience to future fires. And I'm just going to put this quote here. One of the big issues is overstocking of trees. That's one of the costs, and there's not enough funding to do the thinning and prescribe fires within tribal forests. Then we have activities perceived as mitigation. It's not really surprising that everyone's talking about carbon valuation and market and taxes as well. And also they were also discussing the idea of tree planting and more incentives for that and protection of old growth and mature forests. Also, there was a lot of feelings of soil management and also wood production and biomass harvesting often being sidelined in like the public discourse. So that's an interesting perception there held by forest managers. So overall, there's an increased influence and incentives to plant new trees and protect existing trees to offset carbon emissions. And although they seem that that's really promising, they voice a lot of different concerns over this. One is logistics, time, money required to accurately monitor and evaluate forests and appraise their ability to sequester and store carbon. We also need to account for geographic differences of forests. You know, I think something that I found in the interviews from the Pacific Northwest and what are coastal forests is that they see that as maybe more of an appropriate long-term sink with carbon, whereas drier fire-prone forests really need to account and protect that long-term carbon storage and viability of how that forest health is going to go into the future under climate change scenarios. And then, of course, there's treatments, meaning thinning or thinning stands or prescribed burns. That's often being left out of carbon accounting, or at least they feel that way. And then there's this moral complexity, of course, about getting paid for someone else's right to pollute, which is a forest manager for tribal lands. So, to answer the question about what are these relationships and how they perceive, it's a little bit complicated, but this is the most popular framing that we found throughout the interviews. Active forest management and fire adapted and prone regions can be a point of synergy. Installing fuel breaks, having more money and logistics and funding to carry out thinning and prescribed burns, because it stabilizes and protects carbon sequestration and storage of those forests over time, while passive management can increase forest disturbance risk. Passive management meaning not having really clear objectives or minimal objectives to a particular forest stand. And so I think they kind of operate on this continuum, and I just want to leave it with, one really interesting quote here. And this may be for more like business-oriented folks, but I also think it's very valuable because any kind of value you place on a forest, I think this is relevant. I'm an active advocate for active management of landscapes that have been managed, not old growth forests, but landscapes that have been managed and should be managed. They're at risk from fire, disease. How do you protect your carbon project from sudden oak death? It's not that you leave it, let it sit, grow, and sequester carbon, and job done. How do you make sure you're protecting that investment? And I think also this quote here kind of describes this growing discussion of how this growing perception through the public of the need for more active management of forests for climate change scenarios. So what are the key takeaways? You can see that what I just said, basically, that it's compatible with long-term protection of carbon services, and I think there's a growing body of literature that also tracks with this, particular to more fire-prone regions in the American West. Also, we really have to consider location here. I mean, Pacific Northwest coastal forests often prioritize carbon management over risk management, at least in the interviews, whether it's the opposite in fire-prone forests. And then there's this terminological tension, which I think is really interesting, that when asked about what's the role of climate action in silviculture, some participants say that it's already a natural component of that field of study. You have to accommodate for, longer-term climate planning and how that impacts future planting efforts, whereas others believe it hasn't fully been embraced yet. So that's a little bit confusing, but I think because we don't have a clear answer there, that just highlights the need for more intentional climate planning and forestry. So with that, I want to thank you for staying a little bit later and listening to my presentation. And if you have any questions, just come up to me and ask. And this is our paper. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. We have one final fantastic question before everybody goes and eats lunch. Or just any question before everybody eats lunch. Yes, okay, great.
That was a fascinating talk. My question was about the active management piece. Is there a way to quantify the role of active management on reduction of fire risk and actually convert it to a carbon credit that can be used?
Oh, I have no idea. I interviewed for this project, so I guess I'm growing into more of a social science space, but that would be very cool if I could do that. Maybe one day. But yeah, that would be great, and I think it's much needed.
Fire risk as a function of tree density, and so you could build potentially into it the effect of pitting, and then say actually translate it to a carbon credit.
Yeah, actually, there are existing papers on that. One comes to mind. I think it's Pertot from 2019 that actually makes that case in fire-prone, pine-dominated regions in the American West. So that's maybe something to look at, but I don't think it's a model. I think it's more of just a discussion of the benefit of it over time.
Very cool. Thank you.
All right, with that, we'll close the session. Thank you so much again, and thanks everyone for attending. Climate action. So hopefully our goal here is to sort of get a little bit more of the non-agriculture climate actions into the land systems world. So thank you and have a great afternoon.